Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this talk sponsored by the Friends of the Bodleian. I'm Richard McCabe, the chairman of the Advisory Council of the Friends, and we're enormously grateful to you for your continued support of the library. Before I introduce today's speakers, I have just a couple of housekeeping announcements that I hope will enhance the enjoyment of the event. For the best view of the proceedings, select Speaker View from the top right-hand button of your screen. You'll notice that automatic closed captioning is in operation, but this can be discontinued by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of the screen. At the end of the talks, we will have time, as usual, for questions. And I'd ask you to put them into the Q&A and not into chat, because we'll be monitoring the Q&A. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers. And first of all, we have Nicholas Perkins, who is a professor of medieval literature here in the English faculty at Oxford and a tutor at St. Hugh's College. Nick has written or edited 6 books on medieval literature and culture and on responses to the medieval past, including The Gift of Narrative in Medieval England, and of course, most recently, the beautifully illustrated volume that accompanies the Bodleian's current exhibition, Gifts and Books. And it's about that exhibition that Nick will be talking to us this evening, in conversation with Madeleine Slaven, who is head of public engagement at the Bodleian. Before coming to Oxford, Maddie trained as a bookbinder and subsequently worked at the National Archives and the Royal Collections as a book conservator. So without any further ado, I'm now going to pass you over to Nicholas.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that really kind introduction, and welcome to everyone. It's fantastic to have you all here. I can't, of course, see you, and in some ways it'd be lovely to have an event right in person, but I'm really pleased that you've all been able to join us. So I'm going to start off the talk. I'm going to talk for a little while, perhaps about 15-20 minutes, about the Gifts and Books exhibition, and about the book that's connected to it as well. I'm going to say a few things about the exhibition itself, and then talk a little bit about some of the other work that we've done around the exhibition, different projects which have helped to engage other communities, particularly people who might not otherwise wander in to the Western Library and have a look at Gifts and Books. So what I'm going to do, and this is probably the most terrifying and difficult bit of the evening, is that I'm going to try and share my screen and put a series of slides on there. So in the next few minutes, you should be able to sort of see those slides, but also probably see me a bit as well. I'm just going to see what I can do with that now. Okay, so what I hope that you can do now is that you can see the slides, and I'll try and I'll just sort of work through them. If there's any sort of technical problems and so on, I think the Q&A, as Richard said, would be the place for you to note anything there. Okay, I'm just checking. Great, I'm checking the messages. Yep, everyone can see me, which is brilliant. So I'm going to move on in a moment, but first of all, just to talk about really the main image that we've used for Gifts and Books, which is something that when you're an academic sort of thinking about an exhibition isn't necessarily the first thing that you imagine. But in this case, this particular picture of a young man presenting a book to a young lady is something that I've known for a long time. It's a manuscript. It comes from a manuscript that was written probably in the 1520s in London, MS Ashmole 45, and it contains a medieval romance called The Earl of Toulouse, Now, the picture which is shown here isn't really anything to do with that story. It seems to be a picture that's put on the title page of the manuscript to note the gift, perhaps, of that book from one person to another. And people have speculated that the occasion for that gift might well be something like an engagement. They're a young couple. The man's presenting this book to the lady. And underneath, which is the bit that's kind of cropped out, obviously, on our image here, it spells out a name. It says Maid Maria, and that Maria may well have been the first owner of the book. And there are all sorts of ways in which this simple act and picture of the handover of a book from one person to another can lead us into thinking in all sorts of other ways about what surrounds that act of giving. So the young couple here take their place probably amongst all the family networks that would have gone to make up their engagement, if that's what this is about. So it tells us quite a lot about the social standing of this couple. And it also tells us a little bit about what we might expect to come in the manuscript, and why that particular adventure story, the Earl of Toulouse, why it may or may not have been a good thing for a young couple to read. Part of the story revolves, for example, around the faith, the fidelity of a wife who's left alone by her husband and has to fend off people who are other men who are trying to seduce her. So that's the main striking image. And Maddie and I might talk a little bit later on about all the decision-making and questions that sort of go to make that up. And one of the things that you often perhaps lose by only having one image for an exhibition rather than a whole variety is the sense of the range and spread of the exhibition, which is something else that we really wanted to get across. So the range goes from something like 2000 BCE to a few months ago, about 4,000 years of items in our exhibition. So a question that then arises is, well, how can you bring all of those things together in some kind of coherent set of groupings? And I've got quite used now to taking people around the exhibition in groups. And so what I normally say to those groups, ranging from primary school children to older people, there's a group called Meet Me in the Library that we hosted a while ago. What I say is that the Gifts and Books exhibition firstly highlights and celebrates amazing books that really were gifts. The second thing it does is that it explores narratives about giving, about generosity, about exchange. And sometimes those are difficult narratives. They're not all fluffy, but they've given rise to a huge amount of really interesting literature and storytelling. And then leading on from that, I think the third sort of main theme that brings the exhibition and the book together is the idea that storytelling itself is a form of gift giving. And we can sort of see that in our everyday lives when we sort of nurture a friendship, let's say, by listening to that person, hearing their story, being able to reciprocate. And so it goes on. Okay. As part of the whole Gifts and Books project, something that I and the outreach teams in the Bodleian have done is talk to people about precious books that they've received, or for them to nominate a book that they might like to give and give reasons for it. So I've given a couple of examples here. This is just a copy of the cards that we've used for people to fill in. If you were to give a book, what would it be? Who would you give the book to? And why would you give it as a gift? So that's one aspect of it. If you were to give a book, what would you give and why? And we had another card, which is kind of the reverse, I suppose. Tell us about a treasured book you received as a gift. What was it? And why did you appreciate receiving it? And it's actually been really extraordinary, the range and the very sort of moving little stories that we've had back through people filling in those cards, or contacting us online. And also there's a space just outside the exhibition room itself to fill in a little like luggage gift tag and hang it up on our gift book story wall. I'm kind of assuming that some of you might have been able to visit the exhibition and some haven't. So I'll please forgive me if some of the things I'm saying about it are things that you know already. What I'd be really interested in fact, is if any of you wanted to have a think about those two questions, and if you wanted to share a story about a treasured book, or just the name of a book that you've received that you really still love, or something that you would give and why, then please do feel free to write that into the Q&A bar as well. So we've got those two questions. If you were to give a book, what would it be and why? And what would be a treasured book that you received as a gift? Okay. So I'm just going to show you and share with you a couple of the responses that people have come up with. So these range from fairly standard books to all sorts of different ones that we wouldn't necessarily expect. Here's one. It was the first classic book given to me by my aunt when I was about 11 or 12. I was put off at first by the cover and dense writing, but when I got round to reading it, it was a gateway into a whole new grown-up world of reading. I always rated my aunt's recommendations after that, and book conversations have been at the heart of our relationship. She treated me like an adult, and I felt respected. I really love that one, partly because it's not only talking about the gift of a book, but also that idea that then the conversations about books are also a kind of gift exchange as well, which I'm sure many of us can empathize with through book groups and through our relationships with friends. Now, I don't know whether any of you can guess which book that was. I'll give you a little clue. And it is, as some of you might have realized, Jane Eyre. Which all fits that idea about entering a grown-up world of reading. I think is really significant for that book. Here's another one. We went to see Joan in concert. As the support act was ill that night, Joan came on and covered. She played for approximately 2.5 hours. That night, I was drawn into the lyrics of Joan's songs, a range of fun and upbeat songs to the thoughtful and moving. I love each page of the book. Okay, so this is a book of song lyrics by Joan Armatrading, The Weakness in Me. And finally, as another example, my mother read the book to my older sister and me before we slept. If we hadn't had the chance to enjoy the story, we wouldn't love the UK so much. We learnt a lot about English culture as well as how and when English people feel happy, to which I'm sure the answer to that is probably not very often, but I don't know if any of you can guess that one. It is, in fact, Mary Poppins. So I'm quite intrigued by this person and this family about learning English culture through Mary Poppins. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about a few key items that are in the exhibition, ranging from the really early, like this one here on the page, right through to one of the most recent items that we've got in the exhibition. So, of course, I can only just dip into a few of these. I'm going to say just a little bit about each one and why it relates to the themes of the exhibition. We might be able to come back to some of those points in conversation as well. So something else to say, of course, is that to find out more about any of these items, and I've chosen ones pretty much in this talk, which are also featured and discussed in our book of the exhibition, then that is the place to go. So I'm the curator of the exhibition, but really what I have done is ask a whole load of other people who are much more expert than me, loads of questions about some of these items. I've piggybacked on their expertise, and then I've kind of brought it together. So my day job, as Richard said, is teaching and researching medieval English literature. So I know a little bit about that material, but I certainly don't know about ancient Sumerian tablets. And I don't know a huge amount really about, say, Dickens or contemporary literature, but it's been a huge amount of fun finding out about that. But one of the things about doing a book alongside the exhibition is that I could use the expertise of the people that I asked to write chapters to help me organize the material. So the person who wrote a really fantastic chapter in our book about this early mythological and religious material is Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou, who's a professor of, I think it's ancient religion and Bible studies at the University of Exeter. So she talked to me about this tablet, and we were really lucky to have been able to borrow it from the Ashmolean Museum for the exhibition. And she says a little bit about it in her chapter too. So it's an inscribed tablet using cuneiform lettering. It comes, as the text here says, from the temple of a god called Ningirsu in the ancient city of Girsu, which is in modern day Iraq. And it's almost certainly commissioned by a man called Shulgi, King Shulgi of Ur. And you can see from the dates of his reign that we're talking way back, before 2000 BCE. So I'm going to read out the translation here of the inscription on the stone. And the way the picture shows it, it's showing us what they call the obverse of the stone, and then they've also included or sort of photoshopped in photos of the sides of the stone, and there would be one more photo showing the reverse, the rear side of the stone. So most of the inscription is here on this side. For the god Ningirsu, mighty hero of the god Enlil, his lord, Shulgi, mighty man, king of Ur, king of the lands of Sumer and Akkad, built his temple of Bagara for him. So one of the interesting things I think here is that, of course, it's not a book as a gift, but it is an early use, as we have it, of writing to talk about, to describe, to celebrate gift giving. This stone was buried underneath, I think, the entranceway to the temple in a kind of brick-built enclosure. So it wouldn't have been out on public display, but the idea of it is that this stone, with its inscription, would all the time be calling out to the god, reminding the god of the gift that King Shulgi had given him. I like to think of it as a gift tag, really, on a present that the king has given to the god. And the implication there is that there's this ongoing relationship between humans and gods. Humans giving sacrifice, building temples, obeying the rules, gods providing protection, harvests, the rule book, the potential of an afterlife in certain religious traditions as well. And both in the exhibition and in the book, we talk about that across various religions and cultures. Okay. So my next example is a medieval manuscript. And if you do have the chance to go into the exhibition and see it, it is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, this is one of the books that really literally shines out at us from the display case. And the lighting on this object is particularly brilliant, I think. It is called the Abingdon Missal. It was quite probably made in Oxford, this manuscript. And here, in this particular page, it's showing, of course, a picture of the crucifixion. Alongside the scene is the man who commissioned this manuscript, the man who's sort of kneeling there on the bottom left-hand side. He's called William Ashenden, and he was the abbot of Abingdon in the mid-1400s. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about this scene, and we see that in a lot of medieval texts, is the way in which paying for something buys you access. Now, we're very familiar with that, perhaps, unfortunately, in all sorts of modes of life now. But here, Ashenden has paid for access to the divine. His gift of the manuscript means that he also, his prayers, people praying for him, people looking at this devotional image would include him in that dynamic as well. And it's apparently his coat of arms alongside the Abbey's coat of arms that are there on this page to identify him as well. So this, if you imagine the book open, this is what we would call the verso, so the left-hand page. And just opposite, when we open the whole thing up, again, is this beautiful recto page, the right-hand page there. What's going on in that initial letter at top of the right-hand page? Well, this is the story of Abraham and Isaac, the father being told by God to sacrifice his own son, and then at the last minute, getting a reprieve. And you can probably see that red sort of angelic figure there, who is sort of staying the sword and pointing down below to the animal that Abraham can sacrifice instead. In medieval Christian theology, the story of Abraham and Isaac prefigured the crucifixion, a God sacrificing, or a man sacrificing his son. So here God allows his son to be sacrificed. So they were very sort of closely bound up, those two stories. And they also relate to a whole cycle of gift and exchange in medieval Christianity as well. This is the point of the Mass ceremony, the Eucharist, where the priest is talking about the bread and the wine and calling them holy gifts. And then on the other side, you have Christ, as it were, giving his life as a gift to redeem people. That word redeem, redemption, of course, literally means to buy back something in Latin. And if I had more time, I would love to know a little bit more and sort of think a little bit more about all the hands in all these pictures. So I've given you a few examples here. You know, there's God with open hands gesturing down. We've got the dove, the Holy Spirit, as it were, with open hands or wings there too. Christ's hands in pain are sort of curled around the bloody nails of the crucifixion. And then there's a lot of emotion that goes into the gestures of the Virgin and of St. John at the foot of the cross. On the other page, we've got all that's going on with the hand gestures in those images as well. There's a huge amount even in those pictures to think about and to represent this whole cycle of give and take. Okay. So another example, which I won't say much about, which again, whenever I go into the exhibition space or whenever I read the chapter about early modern books written by Felicity Heal, who's a very distinguished emeritus fellow of Jesus College, Oxford, she talks about Tudor royalty and giving and the ways in which in the early modern period communities are bound together by the exchange of gifts. And this object, I think, is just magic. MS Cherry 36 is a book that was made by Queen Elizabeth I when she was a child. As you can see, I hope you can see the sort of writing there. I'm moving myself down so I can see what I've written. She translated the text, she copied it out very carefully. She almost certainly made and embroidered the beautiful cover here as well, which is of silk and gold and silver thread. And she's put KP on the front cover for Catherine Parr, her stepmother. So she gave this book to Catherine Parr as a New Year's gift. And here on this page, you can see the dedication that she's written to Catherine. She says, "To our most noble and virtuous Queen, Catherine." Okay, so we're whisking through the exhibition. It's not solely organised chronologically. There's a lot of sort of thematic connections as well, but I've sort of organised what I'm going to say very, very roughly chronologically. What have we got here? A really familiar opening of a book, A Christmas Carol by Dickens. And I suppose when we look back at something like Dickens's Christmas Carol, we think of it as being sort of traditional, but actually there's a lot of transition in 19th century attitudes and publishing around gifts, and especially Christmas. So establishing Christmas as being this very important time for giving, and particularly for giving books, is something that's ongoing through the 19th century. And developments in print technology in the publishing industry meant that it was more plausible for publishers to produce relatively inexpensive but pretty or beautiful books that one could buy as a gift at Christmas time. There's a whole kind of genre of annual publications which collected together essays and poems and things that we just now call Victorian gift books. So Christmas Carol is something that Dickens both wanted to have as a book to raise money, to be successful commercially, but also it's got a lot of thoughtful reflection on generosity, on Christmas, but also on gifts and storytelling more generally as well. I've got a couple of quotations here from two people who sort of commented on the book for our project. So Faith Binks there, that's a quotation from the chapter of our book. She says, talking about Fezziwig, the figure here, of course, dancing at Christmas past, that he fizzes with brio and good humour. He opens his house, heart and wallet while remaining very much the master of the scene. And if you go into the exhibition, or even on the exhibition website, you can listen to some audio clips about objects. My colleague Ushishi Dasgupta talks a little bit about A Christmas Carol there too. She says, Dickens spent his whole career working through the implications of reading or writing as a form of gift. He wanted his readers to do something with the real and metaphorical gifts they had received. Okay. Here, I've just given you to sort of orientate yourself, just given you a photo of the display case where we've got some of those materials. We've got Christmas Carol in the middle there. On the right-hand side, some of those Christmas gift books. And on the left-hand side, really interesting material, I think, which is early book tokens, which I can talk more about later on if anyone is interested. Okay. If we were to be in the exhibition room and just turn round to face the other way, we'd see this case, which is about children's books. And coming towards the end of my bit of the talk, I'm going to pick up a couple of ideas about that. So with the section on children's books, I wanted children, young people, to be interested in the exhibition. Now, you don't have to have children's books to do that, but I think there's a huge variety and really interesting material there for us to have a look at. And the way that we envisaged it was that some of the early material created, sustained myths of the gift. And books for young people are doing the same thing now. They're creating new myths of the gift, essentially. Here's an example. It's not exactly new now. It's from the late 19th century, of course. This is The Happy Prince by Oscar Wilde in a mid-20th century edition that I think is really bold and striking. A story, of course, about generosity, about all sorts of other things as well. And another example of really contemporary children's writing, which I think is very thoughtful about gift giving, is this book, Zetta Elliott's book, The Ghosts in the Castle. We've got some of the original artwork for the book on display in the exhibition. And Zetta Elliott's work takes some sometimes very difficult political questions and problems, questions about race, questions about power, and it uses a children's narrative or a children's eye view to work through and to some extent in the fiction of the story to solve or resolve some of those questions. Here, two children, Zaria and Winston, who meet a ghost in Windsor Castle, who's a ghost, essentially a ghost of the colonial past. And they buy him this cloth and some other presents to try and sort of soothe his passage into the afterlife. I'm really pleased to say that Zetta is coming to our Gifts and Books Day that I'm going to talk about a little later on Saturday, the 21st of October, to give some readings and talk a bit about her work. Okay. So finally, from me, a book that is probably the most recent item, nearly the most recent item in the exhibition, a book that was finished just a few months ago. We're all relieved that it was done in time for the exhibition itself. And this is by book artist Paul Johnson, who makes these incredible pop-up books. To say they're a pop-up book is sort of doing them down almost, it seems. It's big, it's bold, it's so colourful. And it also is a form of inspiration from previous artists, from the 17th century poet Thomas Traherne, and from the 20th century composer Gerald Finzi, who set some of Traherne's poems to music in a cantata called Dies Natalis. Now, Paul Johnson listened to a recording of that piece and was really inspired by it. And this book kind of represents that gift of inspiration from one artist to another. I think it might be quite a good time. I'm just going to show you a couple of other things, but then it might be a good time for Maddie to join if you're around, Maddie, and we can have we can sort of continue the conversation talking a bit more about like how the exhibition came to exist and how we work together. This is your chance to say, you know, how terrible it was to work with me, and the other things that we're trying to achieve with the whole project. So I'm just going to, before we just sort of start talking about that, I'm just going to show like a sneak preview of the other things that we've got here, because we'll talk about some of these. So we've got the book of the exhibition. We've got an art project that we might come back to, a project with primary schools, and a link up with something called the Oxford Flash Fiction Prize. I've got the photos of our judges there and what the prize anthology will look like. That's going to be launched on the 21st of October as well. Okay, so I'm gonna leave up the picture of Paul's amazing book. And Maddie, we could have a chat about how it's been and, you know, how exhibitions even come to be in the Bodleian.
Yeah, and it's so lovely to hear you talking about the themes in the books again, because it takes me back to 2019 when you first, you and I first met with one of the curators at the library, and you sort of have this idea. And that's generally how Bodleian exhibitions will begin. They'll begin with often an academic, who comes and says, I've got this idea. And from that, we do have an internal process, which is an exhibitions committee and formal processes. But, once it's been passed, what we want to understand is there an audience for this? Who do we think might be, who might be engaged with this content? And also, do we have the collections? Because I suppose what we're trying to do with Bodleian exhibitions is introduce more people to our amazing collections, and also to the research and the research stories that are going on within the academic community, but to make them accessible to people who are not specialists, who don't read Latin, who don't have have that kind of background in in the particular subject. But I think the other thing we are really trying to do, and I think this exhibition was an amazing vehicle for that, is we are trying to build a kind of community around books, and that's where, you've still got Paul Johnson's slide up, and that's a community that involves the academics who work with the books, the students who come to Oxford to study them, but also people like me, people like, the Oxford citizens who are walking around, readers, all kinds of people, book artists, all kinds of people who have that kind of interest and actually already are part of a kind of community of bookishness. And I think that's why, this exhibition, gave us that opportunity, and it gave us the opportunity to engage with those people before and during, and actually I think afterwards, because you and I are still talking about how we might talk with colleagues at Oxfordshire City Libraries, and actually there can be a legacy with this. So some of the things that we did, like using the book questionnaire cards, asking people, think of yourself as a reader and share your knowledge with us, and then we post these up on the wall using book labels. And I don't think we were sure if people would do that. I mean, we bought a big box. We wondered about how to do it. We bought a big box of, I think, 1,000 labels. And you and I wrote one each. So did others in the team. We put them up and we thought, oh God, is that going to be it? And that box of 1,000 went within 3 months. You know, we're on to, you know, we're halfway through box number 2.
Mm.
You know, and I think that's just, you know, that just shows how engaging this, you know, this whole question, you know, we're a city of readers, you know. And then other parts of the process and the putting together of the exhibition, I guess, gives opportunities to allow people to take part. So another thing that we did was the Christopher Strachey love letters. Again, sort of thinking about how a computer programmer from the 1950s, how he used words and that gift of words in a kind of almost jokey way, you know, writing a program that would produce a love letter, but thinking, well, actually visitors to the exhibition might want to do similar. And so, you know, we find a way with magnetic words and poetry to kind of, you know, to kind of form words within the exhibition.
Yeah, and that actually has been when I've sneaked into the exhibition room and had a look around or been there. There's often been quite a lot of people who are giggling and sort of just being creative with those words as well. I do have a couple of...
I mean, it should be a fun thing, you know, the exhibition. It's not about teaching and telling. It's about taking part. And I think also just thinking about process, Nick, you know, where we start is with a long list that you compile, you know, based on your knowledge and your research. But as you said, it is collaborative. So then added to that comes ideas from the team, ideas from other curatorial, you know, staff within the library. You know, there's a lot of suggestions. One thing I was thinking was we added the new acquisition from the 15th century medieval manuscript, Dow's 311. And this was a book which has been in the library for since the 19th century as part of Francis Dows's collection. But the library had recently acquired a leaf showing the Magi that had been taken out of the book, sold, dispersed, but had just been acquired. And so that was another, a bit like Paul Johnson's book, that was another opportunity to actually bring a gift. You know, in a sense, it was, you know, it was due to the generosity of a number of funders,
including the Friends of the Bodleian,
Friends of the Bodleian. That we were able to include that in the exhibition.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, because again, we started with those conversations about the idea of an exhibition. I went off and got together a kind of long list of things, and I knew of some items that I thought, oh well, you know, that absolutely has to be in the exhibition. And then there were other items that I just sort of came across by talking to people, including the people who contributed to our book. I had to do a lot of that research online because it was the pandemic. And I did lots of just searching around using keywords on the Bodleian's catalogue and just sort of finding pictures and just sticking them in folders and things like that. Slowly the kind of shape of the different sections could come together, partly based, of course, around the constraints of which physical cases there are in the room and how those would look. But then there are things, as you say, like the new acquisition of that amazing, really beautiful picture of the Adoration of the Magi. And I seem to remember we sort of had a tentative email sometime from Martin Kaufmann, who's the sort of head of medieval manuscripts, saying, oh, we might possibly be able to acquire these. If we do, is there any space for them in the exhibition? And we sort of rethought things in order to accommodate that. And the same with our conversation with Paul Johnson must have been perhaps about this time last year, when he then offered to make that amazing book and give it to the library. And if you remember, when we talked to him, he had this idea that what he wanted to do was to finish the book in public in the Western, in the Blackwell Hall in the Western, and carry it directly into the display case. We didn't quite manage that, but he did do some workshops in the Western, sort of showing people how to make pop-ups and to sort of be creative
And
with books as well.
I think that's also true, Nick, you know, that there are lots of challenges and there's lots of things that we start off when we're planning an exhibition that we want to do, or we think, I wonder, could we? And sometimes they have to be changed and adapted. I mean, the one that comes to mind was, we thought, oh, wouldn't it be absolutely fantastic if we could have a kind of book exchange actually going on in the library where people could physically bring books that they were finished with, you know, the kind of street library, the phone box library, and people could bring books in and they could take books away. And we really wanted to make that happen, but couldn't quite square it with, you know, preservation issues about bringing in books that might be a little bit moldy, or books that might have pest issues, or just the fact that people would be walking in and out of a library that doesn't lend and has really secure collections. And I suppose out of that kind of inability to find a way to deliver that, we latched on the idea of, okay, we'll ask people to give a recommendation instead.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been really fantastic. I you know, we thought it might work in some circumstances, but it's been really great. And it's lovely to see from really experienced readers, you know, some of the book groups that the community sort of engagement team work with, to the primary schools that I was working with the author Patience Agbarbi.
Yeah,
they all immediately cottoned on to that idea of recommending a book or talking about a book or something that they had been given. And the children that we worked with were really fantastic in sort of being creative with the objects and with the idea of gift giving as well.
And I think that's an important point, that, you know, with our exhibition program, we're kind of doing two things sometimes. You know, we're creating an exhibition in the gallery space, and we're marketing that and advertising that to people that we think will come. But we also know that there's some audiences, and to be honest, they won't come unless we run a special project. Either they can't come because they're, you know, they're unwell, or they're elderly, or they're in hospital, or they probably wouldn't. And that's where these special projects can be really so valuable.
Yeah, one of the children who came to a visit. So Patience and I went into the schools. Then in the middle session, the schools came to the exhibition, and then Patience and I went back again. But in their visit to the exhibition, one of the children, who's from East Oxford, said, "Well, I've never been in a library before, so this is what libraries are like." And, you know, we smiled because, of course, you know, the Bodleian isn't just any old library, but it was really fantastic to see them engaging with that and sort of really thinking, wow, a library is somewhere to be creative, and we can, you know, we can really sort of work with that. That was really brilliant.
And also, you know, using what we call the space for reading, which is that space in Blackwell Hall where, you know, we can take that theme of books, cultures of giving, and we can take it out of the exhibition gallery and sort of spread that into Blackwell Hall and say, well, sit down and read a book that somebody's recommended, and then, you know, leave a comment, you know. And again, it's about that building of community around this idea of books. And I think the exhibition has been, you know, it's been one of the best that we've done. I would say it's been one of the best that we've done, to, you know, with that end in sight, that idea of, you know, we are readers. You know, it's not about we are the custodians of books and we're going to tell you about them. It's actually that we're all sharing in this kind of magical world of reading literature and books.
Yeah, no, that's great. And as someone, so in a sense, as an academic at the university, I spend some of my time sitting upstairs in the Western, in the manuscripts reading room. And of course, I really appreciate that sort of support and, you know, curatorship and efficiency that the Bodleian sort of needs to have in that kind of professional research environment. But I also think that it's incredibly important for that public face, that sort of open door that the new building, the Western Library now has, to do more, to do as much of that as possible, and to make that a kind of real space where people feel that they can come in and have a look. Yeah.
And one of the other things, of course, we had to haggle over or negotiate a little bit was also what other collections we were going to bring in to the exhibition beyond the Bodleian's own. And so, there was the gift that Paul Johnson, brought to the library, but then there were also things like we wanted to have the Horn of Wolf from the York Minster, and part of what I'm doing when I'm managing the exhibition program is looking at the resources, and that's kind of, well, what kind of staff have we got, and can we physically do the things, can we manage the design, can we get the install done in time, but also, have we got the funds to bring in a loan, so there were a few things that we wanted that we had to kind of say, well, that would be lovely, but actually we can't really justify that within the budget we've got. And one of those was, for example, the piece of book art from Edinburgh.
Yeah, so I don't know whether anyone's come across this. It's something that's called the Poetry, with like TREE at the end. And it's an extraordinary sort of anonymous book sculpture that looks like a tree that was given to the Scottish Poetry Library. And then several other of these book sculptures sort of made from books and sort of depicting sort of really beautiful scenes were given to cultural institutions in and around Edinburgh about 10 years ago. And I heard about this and I really wanted it, and I was nagging Maddie for us to get it, but it was just really the logistics of getting it here were complicated and expensive, and there's a lot that has to go on there. Yeah.
But we were very glad to get the York Minster Horn of Wolf. That was
and I'm happy to sort of talk or answer questions about any of those other aspects of the exhibition, or any particular items if anyone's been into the exhibition and that they're intrigued about them, or why they are in, or why they're not in. I'm really happy to answer any questions about that. Yeah. So Maddie, lots of people, when I take tours around the exhibition, inevitably that I get asked what is my favorite item in the exhibition, and what I normally say is, well, today my favorite item is, and then I choose one that I'm quite fond of, but I it's really hard for me to decide. But have you got any particular items that you are particularly fond of?
Yeah, I think Shelley's guitar, again, I'm going to choose a non-book item, which might be a bit cheeky, but I think Shelley's guitar is one which is a real favourite. I think, it's such a magical and evocative piece. This is a guitar that the poet Shelley bought when he was in Italy, and it comes with a poem, to his friend Jane, and the idea that these two things go together, and that a collection like this could have such sort of evocative pieces that give you this moment in time. And it's very beautiful too.
Yeah. And actually, I've just stopped sharing my slides, but one of the slides from the primary school that shows some of the primary school work had a little riddle that one of the children had written about Shelley's guitar, which I thought was very beautiful, actually. And the last couple of lines of it was something like, sorrow to joy, 6 strings shaped like a toy. And they were really intrigued by, the guitar especially, and the horn, and these things that weren't actually books, but that relate to the books and tell lots of stories. Yeah. So.
Okay, well, thanks to you both for those presentations. I think give us all a lot to think about, and I hope will encourage people who haven't seen the exhibition to come in and see it now. We have 1 or 2 questions in the Q&A, and one of them is in fact about the horn. As a resident of York, can I ask you to explain why the horn is in a library exhibition?
Yes. Why is it in there? Well, it's one of the items that I really wanted to have in the exhibition, and I suppose the reason for it is that I also wanted to display, which is now alongside it in the exhibition case, a Bodleian manuscript, MS Lord Misk 108, which to a medieval English scholar sort of is one of these sorts of really important manuscripts that's got a lot of relatively early English texts in. It includes a couple of what we call early romances. One of those romances is called King Horn. And it's an English version of a story that circulated very widely in the Middle Ages about a hero who's called Horn. The story itself probably emerged from these like Anglo-Norman world. There's a wonderful French, like what we call French of England or Anglo-Norman poem based around the hero Horn. So we have a poem there and a story about someone whose name is Horn, and people are always punning on his name in the poem. And there's a very important scene in the poem where he has to come back and rescue his lover from getting married off to someone else. And he drinks from a drinking horn at the wedding feast. He's in disguise. And he drops into the horn a ring that Rigmel or Rimenhild, his lover, has given him. And then when she finds it inside the drinking horn. So there's lots of play around that in the story. But actually, the Horn of Ulf, this amazing, it's elephant ivory horn that was given to the church at York about 1,000 years ago, is itself, what I would argue is, it is itself a kind of storytelling object. So it's not a book, but loads of stories have grown up around it. And that's partly because it's a gift. And something I always think of with gifts is that someone gives you something, but as much as anything, the continuing value of that object in your life is the story that attaches, that's between you and the person who's given it. And so you might, so for example, I've got, a set of spoons that my mum gave me, but they were actually a wedding present to her from this old lady who was a kind of friend of her parents. And I've still got the spoons, and I've got a letter from my mum about them. And I've got a letter from this old lady who was born in the Victorian era, writing in the 1960s to say, oh, here's a present, for your daughter. And to me, that sort of tells a lot more about my family history and everything than just the sheer value of having these things. So the horn is a bit like that in York Minster. It's one of those like iconic or mythical almost objects that has all sorts of stories that are told around it. Literally, it's got a story around it because it's got these silver gilt bands with an inscription which describes how the horn was returned to the Minster after the Civil War, when it went missing for a while. So it's kind of a book, and that's the reason why I put it in an exhibition about books.
Okay, but we have another question that asks about just the category of gift book and says it has quite a pejorative meaning now as something with no reason to be published except as a gift. How old do you think the phenomenon actually is?
Yeah, that's a really good question, isn't it? And I think there are different ways that sort of different groups of people might describe gift books like that. So I'm not at all an expert on Victorian era, but people who study, the history of publishing and Victorian literature, they refer to this kind of category of items, which they call Victorian gift books. And I think it may well be then that idea of a book which is it looks great on the outside. It's often all the money of production, or a lot of it has gone into, say, the cover or a few illustrations. And then very often these gift books, which are frequently sort of annuals, they would have some poems, some stories, an essay, moral sort of upstanding essay or two, some pictures. And so they provided a way for people with it's all relative, but relatively modest income to give something that mimicked, that higher quality type of gift. So what I'm not sure about is how often, or whether that term gift book, whether it's used as a kind of class of objects and pejoratively in the Victorian era, but it's certainly something that scholars talk about now. So I think some of the qualities of gift books were there then. And I suppose now we might look down on them a bit, but there are still all sorts of items that you and I have probably bought for Christmas and they've got a nice wrapper or something like that, a bottle of whiskey in a fancy box or a bottle or something like that. So books, I think, are no different from that.
Yes, it's a sort of book as material object as well, isn't it? To have a beautiful things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we have a third question which asks, it's a rather large question. What was taken into account when choosing the books? I suppose it was about the process of selection from so many possibilities.
Yeah, thank you. That is an absolutely huge question. And when I look back at the process, it's one of those things that it's very difficult always to kind of construct exactly why and how those things worked. I mean, I'll give an example. I thought at one point that in one of the display cases, I'd like to have a whole selection of different pictures of the Magi, the kings, giving gifts to Christ, the scene of the so-called adoration of the Magi, because it's such an important sort of set of images. It's different in different sort of versions across different countries and centuries. And I was imagining having this kind of tree of manuscripts and books that would sort of go up, all showing the same thing. Now, for that reason, I did loads of research on all the different images that I could possibly find in the Bodleian, and there are masses of them. Any of you who've bought Christmas cards from the Bodleian over the last 10 years, whatever, will know that there are all sorts of scenes of the adoration. So I had all those prepared. I've got a big folder on my computer with them all. But then this chance to show this really extraordinary new acquisition of the adoration that was in DAUS 311 came up, and it really made us totally rethink what would be in that case. So instead of
also, it's what's going to look good in the case.
Yeah,
so,
that's true.
So sometimes there can be an absolutely cracking point that the curator wants to make, but actually the object, when you open it, it really isn't going to say that. That you're not going to read. I mean, visitors don't come to the exhibition to read a book in a case. So it's got to be something that they're going to look at, and that's got to be powerful and effective. And sometimes when we lay out, that's a really important part of the process, is we bring the books into, a room in the Bodleian, and we open them we open them up and we set them up in wedges, and we stand back and we think, is this compelling? Does this tell the story that we want it to tell? And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in a sense, that's where you and I, Maddie, have to have a good enough relationship for you to say to me, no, it doesn't work, Nick.
Yeah.
However much you want to have this obscure thing that tells your academic point, then don't do it. And so
it can be really effective, and we often do in an exhibition what we would call the mass display. So we put up, 10, 15, 20 items, which all together make that point about quantity, about, types of style, about, genre, about, whichever the point is. But we can't do that in every case, not least because practically we would run out of book supports, so we might do that once and then another time think, it's not worth it.
Yeah. And so that's really important, that negotiation between what sort of academically works and what tells a story for someone who's walking through the room, but also literally, do they look beautiful or coherent? And I remember when we were actually doing the sort of installation of the exhibition, looking at, for example, the case, which more or less mostly has early modern material, so sort of Tudor and 17th century material. And I just love the way it looks, and that's partly, again, thinking about Richard's point about the physical history of books, the way in which things like rich fabrics like velvet and silk and the silver and gold thread that's used and sort of embossing, how those all go to make up the book as an object at that time, and it's far more than the text that's in there, and the variety of materials is great.
It's a bit, Nick, isn't it, like that advice that people used to be given: get dressed and then take one thing off, and that's how you kind of we'll be a little bit classier. I think we do that sometimes in exhibitions, construct the case and then take one book out, because there's nothing worse than overcrowding your case and losing your message.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We don't have any more questions in the Q&A, but I think one of the things that struck me just looking at the exhibition and so on is the way in which gift books can often bring print and scribal culture together, that somebody writes an inscription which personalizes a printed work. So you have a piece of text that only the person receiving the gift actually has.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Richard. And again, something that we definitely considered was having a big display of books with inscriptions in, you know, perhaps by authors or something, which we probably could have done. But again, we thought that they didn't quite look, there was something not quite right about them.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right that it's like that combination. And the more an object perhaps is available in a commodified form, like a cheap paperback, to some extent, the more you can distinguish your gift by doing something really different, by personalizing it. And I think that that's really important. And so some people might argue that that whole gift culture idea has sort of drifted away a bit and we're much more commercialized. But actually, people are very inventive at making things personal. And I think we can always find that in the history of books.
And indeed, the Christina Rossetti item that we exhibited was a lovely example of that, where she personalizes a copy of her poetry for her mother, for her aunt,
That's right.
for her mother. Yeah.
That's what I was thinking of. Yes. Well, I think we're just reaching 6 o'clock, so I think we're going to have to leave it there. And it just remains me to thank Nick and Maddie for a wonderful presentation, wonderful description of how things were chosen and the importance of books as gifts. And I think it will encourage anyone who hasn't seen the exhibition to come to the Western, because you really, I think, have to experience it. The 1 or 2 photographs you showed us of the cases and all the rest of it, they need to be seen in person, I think, to be really appreciated.
Yeah, so the exhibition's on until the 29th of October. We've got our special Gifts and Books Day on the 21st. And also you can buy the book, which is a beautiful gift book in itself, which is one of the whole ideas of it too.
Okay, well, we shall say goodbye in that case and close the session.
Thank you very much. Thank you.